Across the country, there is a new trend in higher education. The number of men enrolled in colleges and universities is dwindling. A recent survey revealed males account for 43% of the U.S. college population. 37% is the number at St. Petersburg College. SPC has made a promise to do something about it.
It's really inspiring because they are there definitely for you at any point of your life, trying to help you out and trying to bring you back to the right track.
The Male Outreach Initiative was developed in 2005 to assist all men regardless of ethnicity, income level, or age. These students are provided opportunities in career assessment, mentoring, financial needs, and academic support, all while fostering an educational environment for success at SPC and in the future.
SPC is helping me get a sense of direction, a sense of learning how to work for something, and that's what I want. I want to work for something so I know what its worth is.
Through scholarships, mentoring, tutoring, employment, and networking, the Center sets a standard for helping our male students gain the necessary skills to enter the career world.
I would tell other males like myself that the outreach program can really help them, and they should look around, because that's what I was lacked of. I mean, I wasn't really looking around. I was just sitting there waiting for something to happen, but then again, SPC was right here offering everything that I needed.
For more information on the Male Outreach Initiative or to help with the programs it offers, visit our website at spcollege.edu or call 727-791-2673.
Get it because it's worth it to get your education. No one can take it away from you.
The St. Petersburg College Male Outreach Initiative. We're setting the example.
Today we have an internationally known speaker talk about the subject. Peg Tyre is a prize-winning investigative reporter and the author of the controversial and widely praised book, The Trouble with Boys, a surprising report card on our sons, their schools, and what parents and educators must do. A New York Times best-selling writer, Michael Thompson, co-author of Raising Cain, has called it passionate, powerful, and persuasive. Tyre spent 2 decades in journalism as a magazine feature writer at New York Magazine, a newspaper reporter at New York Newsday, an on-air correspondent for CNN, and most recently, as a longtime staff writer for Newsweek covering social trends and education. Between 2001 and 2008, she pursued her passion, examining the fault lines in American culture formed by class, gender, race, ideology, and upbringing for the National Weekly, praised for being analytical, often counterintuitive, and not afraid to take on society's sacred cows. Tyre covers stories were top sellers at the magazine. She was twice nominated for a National Magazine Award, which is the industry equivalent of a Pulitzer Prize, received 2 Clarion Awards, as well as sharing Overseas Press Club Ed Cunningham Prize for magazine feature writing. She was also honored by the Education Writers Association. She has discussed her stories on the Today Show, Good Morning America, Fox and Friends, Anderson Cooper, and NPR. A graduate of Brown University, she has lectured at Harvard University and at the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism, and is a frequent speaker at public and private schools around the nation. She continues to write about education, social trends, and culture. She lives in Brooklyn, New York, with her husband, novelist Peter Blahner, and their 2 sons. Currently, she is a non-resident fellow at the Education Sector, a nonpartisan educational think tank in Washington, D.C., and is at work on another book. Would you please join me in welcoming Peg Tyre?
Thank you very much for welcoming. Thank you very much for coming out, and thank you very much for that warm welcome. It's cold in Florida. I was not really expecting this. I brought my bathing suit, sadly. I did want to thank you for coming out today. I know it's your lunch hour, and everyone's got a busy day, but I did want to tell you a little bit about my book and a little bit about the research that I uncovered looking at this issue of boys and education in the last 2 years. My book came out. I'll tell you a little bit about what's happened to me in the last month. My book, it's called The Trouble with Boys, and it came out in September in the middle of an economic meltdown and a heated presidential election. And it hit the New York Times bestseller list after about 3 weeks. And I thought it would find an audience, but I honestly have to say I was shocked that it found an audience that quickly. And what that told me is that there is a lot of people who are looking at this issue now and are interested and need more information. And what I tried to do in this book is provide a very non-ideological way of looking at this issue. I am by trade an investigative journalist. I've done this for over 2 decades. I'm not an ideologue. I'm not grinding a particular axe. My bias, I like to think all journalists are unbiased, of course, but my bias, and I'll be straightforward with it, is much more as a feminist. I am the grateful beneficiary of the gains of the feminist movement, and growing up, I was much more likely to read a book like Reviving Ophelia about the perilous passage of adolescent girls that they go through in middle school, or a book like Carol Gilligan's How Schools Shortchange Girls. So when I started covering education, I was really more looking for the issues that girls face in classroom. And as part of my job at Newsweek, I left Newsweek in April, but as part of my job for Newsweek, I spent a lot of time in classrooms. And I really didn't see the boy problem because I wasn't really looking. I wasn't looking for that. And I did know about poor African-American boys. I did know that they struggled inordinately and they were not achieving in the ways that poor African-American girls were achieving, and certainly middle-class children were achieving. And their struggles had been fairly well documented in the 80s, so I knew about what they were going through, but I didn't see it broadly as a male problem. It wasn't until I was interviewing a headmaster at a private school, an elite Manhattan private school. The tuition is about $27,000 a year. The selection process is probably akin to Harvard's. It's a very, very selective school. We're talking about something completely different, not boys at all. But the headmaster shared with me that he was very concerned about the lowest performing children, the lowest quartile. Now, even fabulous schools have a lowest quartile. That's how it works. There's some kids who are going to be at the bottom. But what concerned him was there are kids who went to the bottom and seemed to stay at the bottom. And so what they had done, and this is the luxury of running a school that's this wealthy, is that they had launched a giant research project and looked in a very granular way at who those kids were. They wanted to find out what was their common factor that was keeping them down, putting them down, and keeping them down. And so they analyzed everything they knew about them. And what they found was that there wasn't much they had in common. They weren't the arty kids. They weren't the goths. They weren't the jocks. They weren't the scholarship kids or the richie riches. They didn't come from any particular zip code. But all but one of those students were male. So I was very interested in that, knowing that poor African-American boys struggle. And then hearing a headmaster from a very elite Manhattan private school, which tends to be a feeder for very, very wealthy families, and seeing that there was kind of a male malaise there as well, I started to reflect on that. One of the problems with covering education is that it's very hard to write a national education story because schools reflect their particular communities. And so schools themselves are very fragmented, and you can go into a school or 2 schools or 3 schools and observe something that's happening, but you think it's a trend, but actually it's just only happening in those communities. So the only way I can really write about education is to constantly refer to the broader national data. So thinking about this boys issue, I went to the national data, and what I found really stumped me. I really thought it was a fascinating collection of data. And let me just share some of the data points with you. In preschool, boys are expelled at 5 times the rates of girls. In first grade, they're retained at twice the rates of girls. In early elementary school, they are identified as having learning disabilities. In many communities, the kids who are special ed are 70 and 80% male. In middle school, boys do less homework. They carry more C's and D's. That goes right on through high school. It won't surprise you to know that there are many fewer boys on the college track. It used to be in high school that girls dominated in reading and writing and boys dominated in math and science. But that's changed. Girls actually do equally as well in math, and in many sciences they're actually doing better than boys. Boys continue to lag in reading. And in writing, the gap has actually grown in the last 15 years, the gap between the skills of boys and the skills of girls. That's interesting to me, but I just want to say that that data is heightened for me as well. The importance of that gap is heightened because I know from being in schools that we now have a literacy-soaked curriculum, that literacy is the master virtue for our curriculum, especially in the elementary years. So when you have an unaddressed gap, it has larger implications for how kids do in elementary and in middle school. So many fewer boys on the college track, and it won't surprise you to know that there are now 2.5 million more girls in college than boys. The U.S. Department of Education predicts that it will soon be 60-40, 60% female and 40% male in colleges. So I was quite astonished by those numbers, and I was very surprised that no one had written what I thought was a very interesting trend. Sometimes it's hard to write about social trends because they unfold slowly. For example, when we were in the middle of the women's movement, we didn't really see what the implications would be for women going into the workforce. And it's only now, looking back on it, that we can see it was a seismic change in our culture. It changed everything. And so it seemed to me, looking at this data, that we were at the start of a massive social change, and no one was writing about it. So I blithely just stumbled into it, and I just wrote my story, and I tried to present the data as I saw it clearly, and I found programs around the country that were trying to address this gender gap. The story was published on the cover of Newsweek, and to my astonishment, the response was overwhelming. Parents wrote me, from maybe 1,000 parents wrote me, mostly moms, and they said, thank you for writing about the central drama of our family life. And that is, my daughter's at Duke and my son can't get into community college or can't stay in community college. What did I do wrong? And some dads wrote me, and they mostly said, what's wrong with my son's school? And teachers wrote me too, and they said, I know that I'm not reaching the kids in the back row. And those children are boys, and I don't know why I can't reach them, because teachers know. Teachers, by and large, the teachers that I've met, 99% of them, really want to teach children. They want to teach all children, but they know they're not reaching them. There was also a little pushback on the story, and I was quoted in the paper, I guess. I mentioned in my book. There was a woman who sent me an email, and she said, okay, women have been oppressed by men for thousands of years, and now we're on top for a nanosecond, and it's a crisis? She's like, why are you writing about this? And there were some academic feminists who took me to task, and they said that there are such enormous gender equity issues in the workplace that we shouldn't be writing about the underachievement of boys, that this is an attempt to leach oxygen away from these very real struggles. And, you know, to tell you the truth, I'm with that. I understand the nanosecond argument. I get that there's a sense that as women, we don't really want to give back the gains that we've made. And there's a sort of nervousness about this discussion maybe morphing into a kind of backlash discourse. But honestly, as a woman, as a feminist, and as the mother of sons, it's my idea that we should bring education to children in a way that they could all engage in. And if we have a big gender gap, it's certainly not going to just affect men and boys, because ultimately the fates of our children, male and female, are very much intertwined. And it's my argument, and I think I'm on solid ground here, that the growing gap between education and educational attainment between men and women will affect our children. It will affect what kind of work they do, whether they can afford to have children, if they marry, who raises the children, whether they can retire. These are all enormous issues that will be affected by this growing gender gap. So I was very interested in this kind of, in the response and the pushback, because in a way I felt that I was right. You won't be surprised to know. So I held off and I had an opportunity to write this book. And it was really exciting for me because in a magazine article, you are like a giant thrashing machine. You're constantly soaking up information and trying to sort it all out. But it's very, very high-speed process and sometimes very crude. And in a book, you can actually get a chance to really drill down into the information. And my hope for this book was to try and take this dialogue a little further, was not to let it get bogged down in the gender discourse from 1974, but to actually provide teachers and provide parents and provide educators and administrators with good information that they could take into their schools, take into their communities, discuss at their PTA meetings, and build pedagogy on top of that that's more suitable for all our children. So the first thing I did is I went to college presidents, because that difference in educational attainment in college is so, I think, so interesting and has such big ramifications for our culture. So I went to the president of the University of Pennsylvania, who I know and have interviewed, and she's a very dynamic woman. And I said, so what is it with this college gap? They don't actually experience it as much at the University of Pennsylvania, because let me say one thing. Everywhere you look, in every demographic, boys do less well than girls. Poor boys to poor girls, middle-class boys to middle-class girls, affluent boys to affluent girls. But everywhere you look, indeed, there is a thin margin of high-performing boys, a thin margin. But in the main, boys do less well. So that thin margin is probably well represented at the University of Pennsylvania, a very highly selective school. So I asked Amy Gutman, what's going on? Why is there this big gender gap? Where are the guys? And she's very, some might say bossy. I call it more directional. She sort of talks like this, and she's like, well, this is what you should do. There is a pipeline that carries boys from preschool to college, and carries all children from preschool to college, and boys are falling out of that pipeline. If you want to write a good book, she told me, don't look at college, a little defensive maybe, don't look at college, but look at the pipeline. Look and see where boys are falling out. And you know what? I thought that was very good advice. So I took the time and I looked at where the data shows boys fall out. And I looked at what's changed about our child rearing, about our schooling, and about our messages to boys that might be creating this phenomenon. So I found a few things, and I'm going to skip through them and touch upon them. But if you're interested, I would hope that you would check out the book, because the book is it's very, very readable, but it takes topics and it drills down into them. So when you finish reading about a particular topic, you'll feel like you know a lot more. You will know a lot more. And there's a rich index in the back, so if you want to then research it further, you can go where I went. You can go to Google and start expanding on my research. You'll see how to do it. So the first thing I did is go to preschool. And what I found is that we are in the middle of a surge of academics into preschools. As parents and many early educators believe that the sooner we bring our children to academic learning, the better they'll be. And this, we make fun of parents who do the mommy and me Mandarin, who really amp their kids up and do all the programs and drag their kids around and schedule their children. But actually, honestly, I don't make fun of them because I did that. So, and I'll tell you the reason I did that is because I believe, I was told, that children need early enrichment. So I tried to look back and figure out where those messages came from and why we were operating in this fashion. And as it turns out, in the 90s was the decade of the brain. And we finally had access to pictures of what was happening inside the heads of little children. Previous to this, we thought that children were dormant intellectually, that really there was a lot going on for them socially and physically, developmentally, but intellectually, not that much. But when we saw these fMRIs, what we saw is that little kids, toddlers, their brains were alive with burning glucose. And scientists got really excited, and child development people got really excited, and they said, this proves it. You can teach kids more early on. Now, and this message was picked up widely. There was NBC specials, there was a Newsweek 0 to 3 special issue, there were White House conferences on early education and the 0 to 3 movement, it was called. There was a proposition in California which passed to tax cigarettes and fund preschools. There was a big hullabaloo around this. But somewhere along the line, the message morphed, okay? It was directed to poor families, the families who plunk their kids in front of a television and don't talk to them as much as they might. It was heard by middle-class people who got very, very worked up about the idea of early enrichment. And the message morphed in this way. We heard, and we were told, that there's a window of learning that opens much earlier than we thought. True. But somewhere along the line, the idea came into culture that it opens and shuts. And so the idea sort of took hold in culture that if we don't bring our children to academics early, then they can't really live up to their full potential. And I actually think, and I don't put this in the book, but I actually think it has something to do with Henry Kissinger, who was a very big, public figure at that time. He's elderly now, but a very big public figure. And he came here, I believe, from Germany when he was 11, and he always had a very thick German accent. And his brother, who came at 9, talked like a guy from Brooklyn. And I think that made, in some sort of subtle way, in our culture, the Henry Kissinger effect was big. We understood that there was also Suzuki violin, that you could see these little kids who started violin and they become protégés. And there's Henry Kissinger, a genius with this thick German accent, never able to really he's fluent, of course, but speak unaccented English. So this idea took hold that the earlier the better for academics. And we have thrown ourselves into it as a culture, and we do a lot of things. The toy industry is focused on educational toys, okay? This is all brand new. What older parents and grandparents and veteran teachers remember is that this is very new. But what young teachers and young mothers don't know is that this is sort of a fad that just really came up in the last 10 years. It turns out that when you look at the effects of strongly academic preschools, what you find is they do confer an advantage, at least for a short period of time, but then the advantage kind of flatlines. And for boys who are in strongly academic preschools actually end up doing worse in school. I thought that was very interesting and very much worth knowing. So that's one of the ways I think that boys begin to fall out of the pipeline. We know that we run programs that are developmentally inappropriate for a lot of people, and we know they're developmentally inappropriate for boys because so many get expelled, 5 times the rates of girls. So let me take elementary school. So our schools are changing dramatically. We're in the middle of some extraordinary school reform. Federal No Child Left Behind laws and state accountability laws have really changed the way our public schools function. And one of the things that's happened is our curriculum has gotten more narrow. So in many schools, we focus on reading and math almost exclusively. We have very little time for music and art, but we also have very little time for history and science, and we have very little time for recess. Recess is something that's been whittled away, and now, in this country, 39% of first graders get 20 minutes or less of recess a day. Now, you raise your hand if you think it's a good idea for a 7-year-old to go to school between 8 and 3 and have 20 minutes or less of recess a day. Not too many hands. If you've never met a 7-year-old, we know that this is not appropriate, right? But I asked myself this question, okay, that doesn't sound appropriate to me for a lot of children, but why would it affect boys more than girls? So I talked to little 7-year-old boys, and my trained investigator that I am, I went to a first grade, and what they say, when you ask them, what's your favorite subject, they say recess. And not just one says recess, but they all say recess. Now, recess was not that meaningful to me. It seemed noisy, and there was a kickball, and that's kind of all I remember. It was a long time ago. That's all I remember about it. But for these little boys, recess was crucial. But I thought to myself, okay, they express recess being important, but why would less recess confer a disadvantage on them? Could it? So I tried to look at what we know in social science, what we know about boys and movement. Now, it was my idea that boys move around more than girls, but my book is not about my ideas about gender. You have your own ideas about gender, okay? I decided to go and find people who've actually studied movement and gender. So I found this mad scientist in Canada, and he specializes in human development. And he spent a chunk of his career looking at this exact issue. And I have to say, as a journalist, this is why I love academics, because you can always find someone who's completely obsessed with something that to you seems really random, right? So this fellow had Warren Eaton, he's a wonderful fellow. He had a very small grant to check this out, to test this hypothesis that boys move around more than girls. And so his grant was so small that he couldn't afford actimeters like motion sensors, so he had an engineer jury-rig some Timexes. And he sent the kids out to play, and he charted all their movement, what the actimeters showed, how much they moved their arms and legs. And what he found was that, indeed, something any parent could probably tell you, that indeed, boys do move around more than girls. But not that much. There's a big crossover, the Venn diagram of boys and girls and movement. The bulk is in the middle, okay? But when he graphed it from the most sedentary to the most active, he found a very interesting thing that I want to share with you. What he found is that the children who move around the most, who are the kids with ants in their pants, okay, who really their natural development means that they really don't sit still all that much, those are always boys. So, what does that tell you? It says when we curtail recess, when we whittle it down, when we remove opportunities for free play and physical movement in classrooms, in early education, we hurt all children because we know that all children need to move around. But who we really marginalize are those outliers, are the little squirrely boys who really don't sit still as part of their natural development. And I submit to you that they come under a tremendous amount of negative attention simply because they move around a lot. And you can talk to them, again, back to my investigative skills, talking to the first graders. They talk about circle time like I think about the guillotine, okay? They speak about it with such extraordinary dread. Circle time, it's a nightmare for them because it involves a great deal of sitting still, something that they really can't do that well yet. So there's another issue, and I want to talk about it because it's about literacy, reading, and writing. And the issues that I'm going to bring up in this part of my talk really extend from early elementary school straight up through high school, and I think that they're very important. So we have this big gap in reading and writing. Okay, and reading and writing have become extraordinarily important in almost every subject. You can't really take a math course without getting word problems. So we know that reading is very important. Okay, and we know that boys fall out very early in literacy skills. So they begin to drop behind really fast, almost immediately. And the longer they stay in school, the bigger the gap gets. Troubling. So I looked at the process of teaching children to read, and I looked at those perilous points in that process. And there's one that's a very delicate point, And that's when children make their first independent book choices. Reading goes from being a task to actually being something that you do for pleasure. So it goes from being a school task, sound out these words, to actually choosing a book and having the experience of a reader, being taken out of yourself a little bit. Instead of learning to read, it's reading to learn. It's a very, very subtle change, but it's a very important change. So it turns out that in our classrooms, there are fewer and fewer males. We know that we're at a 40-year low for male teachers. And I think there's a lot of implications for that, and a lot of them are unexplored. But one of the things that happens is very well-meaning, very warm, very wonderful female teachers make literature choices in their classroom based on books that they like. So there's a lot of books that they enjoyed as readers and that they feel comfortable with, and they understand how to explicate them for the children. They understand how to talk about them for the children. But unfortunately, a lot of the books that women choose are not books that boys like. Now, I would say to you that I understand when I talk about what boys like. I'm on a little thin ice here because I am talking about half the world, right? So there's going to be a range of what boys like. But when you talk to boys, what they say is they like books about science. They like books about facts. They like a book that I submit to you no woman has ever read called the Guinness Book of World Records. I don't get it, but there it is. They pore over it like the Bible. So they like books about science. They like biographies. They like things that are a little funny, a little irreverent. They like things that are gory. They like things that are scary. But unfortunately, a lot of those books are not what teachers consider classroom material. And so what they say to children is, young boys who make that fragile first selection, they say that's a very good selection, not really a classroom book. I think that's a problem. I think that what it does is it tells boys that reading is girly. And that's what they say back to you. And by the time they're 8 and 9, they say, we don't read because girls read. Reading is girly. And that, I think, is a terrible, terrible decision that they make, and one that has lasting implications for their school success. There's also something that happens in writing, and in order to explain it to you, I'm going to ask you to step back a little bit in history. We live in a post-Columbine world, okay? There have been, and we're in the 90s, and into, tragically, still are, school shootings. And as a former correspondent at CNN, I'll tell you, we gave those, dawn to dusk coverage. There was a time when you couldn't really turn on your television without thinking that your school was a shooting gallery. And it felt very immediate to people. That's what 24-hour news does. It brings random crime into your living room. But it does touch upon a very essential fear for all of us that our children wouldn't be safe. So I understood people, and I understand people's, and of course, people's horror and their sense of real tragedy when something like that happens. And we respond in our communities and in our schools by having zero tolerance for violence policies, because we know that children can't learn unless they're safe. I understand that, and I'm good with that. We also, unfortunately, those zero tolerance for violence policies have morphed into a zero tolerance for aggression policies. And let me tell you how those are starting to look around the country. I went to a school in Los Angeles. 100,000 children attend school in this district, and there is no running on the playground. In many schools, there is no tag. There is no chase games. And when you ask the administrators why that is, they say it brings out the aggression in children. Now, I have a sense that they're not really talking about the aggression in girls. I think that it brings out, I think they're a little uncomfortable with the aggression in boys. But be that as it may, classroom management, school management is a big issue. It's easy to be a critic, especially if you are a writer and don't have to deal with the skinned knees and your irate parents. But what I see in the classroom is many of those anti-aggression policies have morphed into anti-fantasy aggression policies. And there, I think, is a problem. And let me tell you how I think it relates to writing. When you talk to boy psychologists, they tell you that for whatever reasons, boys think and play and talk and draw a lot about violence. There are boys who I've met who are obsessed with Spider-Man, who have Spider-Man. They talk about Spider-Man constantly, who have never actually seen Spider-Man. They've never seen the movie. They've never seen the comic. They have, they demand their parents buy them Spider-Man stuff. Superheroes hold an extraordinary place in their imagination. It doesn't seem to matter whether you raise them, if you're two lesbian parents in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and like the total end of PC, or if you're NRA gun-toting conservatives, it doesn't seem to matter how you raise them. Whatever your political orientation is, or your idea about family is, it seems that some boys, for whatever reason, think a lot about violence. Boy psychologists like Michael Thompson, a person I think is tremendously intelligent and has done a lot of good work, he says that we misunderstand boys and violence. That when boys are playing about violence, what they're really playing about is issues of valor and courage and beating the bad guys and saving the good guys, loyalty, and all these things we really want for our men. Those are the things that boys are exploring, but they do it around ideas that we read as violence. Now, unfortunately, what's happened in our schools is this zero tolerance for fantasy violence has really reached quite an apex, so that when little boys point their finger and bend their thumbs and go pew, that becomes a problem. And it is not hard to find children who have been suspended for very, very minor infractions having to do with pointing pieces of a broken hula hoop at other kids on the playground and going pew pew, pointing their finger, pointing a chicken strip. These have become actionable behavioral problems. Okay? Teachers, I think, and administrators misunderstand what boys are playing around. But the problem, and where it really affects them academically, is that teachers have been taught, there's a very influential program through Petersburg College at Columbia University, and it's filtered out into many, many educational programs around the country, and that is we teach boys to write through we teach all children to write through personal narrative. And people who study this say that's not the way boys write. Boys write a lot about action. There's a lot of swashbuckling. There's arrows flying. Sometimes it's gory. But they don't write around personal narrative. And sometimes they write about things that are violent. And unfortunately what happens, the goal of the teacher is to get a student to translate what's up here, have it go down their arm and come out their pencil. And so children start to write, and boys start to write, and then teachers say, that topic, not good for school. So what they tell boys when they say, turn that gun into a wand on the playground, is that what's in your mind is inappropriate for school. And then they say, please write. And I think that actually depresses the achievement of boys. When you talk to them later in 8th grade, 9th grade, 10th grade, they're a little more reflective, and they say, teachers don't let us write what we like to write about. And I don't think teachers are trying to penalize boys, and certainly not depress their achievement, but I think for some very good reasons, out of very, very moral reasons, out of caring about the well-being of all children, we take steps that inadvertently seem to depress the achievement of boys. Now I'm going to talk about one other thing, and then I think maybe I'll open it up to questions since we might have time for that. But we'll tell you maybe two other things. One, I'll focus on middle school and high school, and this extends into college. It turns out that in middle school, that one of the chief virtues of middle school is being organized, neat, and compliant. And those skills, while they're important, have in many, many schools eclipsed the actual content. You can't actually succeed in middle school and in the early years of high school unless you are organized. Many schools now have organizational helpers. The guidance counselors help kids with organization. We have binder reminders and flow charts, and this is new. And I suggest to you that when you look at people who study who's organized in this world, people who look at kids who are crazily disorganized, they tell you that subclinical cases of disorganization, or just regular scattered kids, are disproportionately male. But when we tie organization to achievement, we create a school system that boys know is a game that they can't win, because developmentally, they're just not there yet. And yet, we make organization the key skill for success. And then we wonder why they play video games, because that's the game they can win. But middle school, increasingly, is a game that they can't win. With this incredible focus on organization, it becomes a system that they don't want to participate in. Now, I know we all have to get there. We all have to find our socks in the morning. We all have to file our taxes and collect those receipts. And we are trying to make good, useful human beings. And, that's the point of school, to create functional citizens. But we're starting earlier and earlier. And there's a push down in these skills. And when you ask middle school teachers or fifth grade teachers why there's a flow chart, why children have to set out a timeline for their day, they say we're getting them ready for middle school. And then when you ask them in middle school, they say we're getting them ready for high school. I think we've pushed it down a little too far, and I think we're bumping up against what is their natural human development, the natural human development of a lot of children, and a lot of them are boys. Now, I'm very hopeful that the achievement gap between boys and girls can be reversed. And here's why I'm hopeful, because I grew up in the late 70s. I went to school in the late 70s and early 80s, and teachers changed it for me. They told me I could do it. They suggested I take advanced courses. They urged me to set my sights high. Teachers did that for me. There was a drumbeat for women to go to school and to get into the workforce. Teachers did that. And I think for many parts of society, teachers and parents and community members can start to do that for boys. One of the very strong programs that I've seen in colleges, one of the problems that really affect colleges is that boys drop out more. They don't show up as much, but then when they get there, they drop out more. And there are few places that are really willing to deal with that issue, that retention issue. And this is one of them. There's a wonderful program here that actually brings boys in and tries to serve them and give them support to stay in school. And I think by articulating that that's what you want for young men, you're doing a wonderful thing, because no one is really talking about what we really want for them. We tell them that we want them to be successful, and then we open two avenues. One, sports, and the other, video game designer. And we don't really tell them how you get from 8th grade through high school, through college, into the workforce. And this program, I think, is a very, very good one, because it does supply those kinds of supports. So other programs around the country that I've seen are, I'm starting from the early grades, are teachers who have sawed the legs off tables so that kids don't have to sit, and kids who can't really sit don't have to sit. I've seen teachers who give running passes to squirrely kids so that when they get really antsy, they have a running pass and they take the pass and they run around the school and they miss 5 minutes of instructional time, and then they are able to sit and pay attention. I've seen teachers bring different kinds of books, including the Guinness Book of World Records, into their classrooms, and librarians who have created the boy section, so boys can read all the Captain Underpants they want in the library. I've seen schools that have looked at this organization issue and have tried to separate organization from academic achievement. And the teachers were brilliant, and they said, what we really want is not kids who can account for their time But in science class, we want them to teach like scientists, think like scientists. And in history class, we want them to think like historians. And I think that was really bold. I think to create an avenue of school success that's a bit aside from organization is terrific. And it really helped them retain their voice who were dropping out in great numbers. It turns out that when you initiate programs that are good for boys, it turns out that they're good for a lot of girls too. The programs that I've seen, nobody has launched a program that turns out to be bad for girls. Nobody wants to roll back the achievement of our high-performing young women. But there are ways that we can support boys academically, that schools are supporting boys academically, and I hope those programs spread. The thing is, they're not going to spread if we don't talk about what's really going on. I mean, you've seen the numbers in Florida. You know who goes to college in Florida. You have to understand what that's going to mean for the next generation. Right now, in 11 urban areas, girls make more money than boys, kids in their 20s. Now, I have no like shock and horror about that. I'm glad girls are making a lot of money. The reason is, though, is the difference in educational attainment. That there's so many more girls with college degrees and advanced degrees that they're pulling down much higher salaries. If you don't think that that's going to have a huge implication for their lives and their children, I think you're not really thinking that seriously about what education means. So I hope I've given you a little food for thought here, and I hope that if you're interested in some of the topics that I've mentioned, that you'll take a look at the book, because there's a lot of information in there, and it's a good sort of starting point to look at your own schools or your own communities and see if there's a problem that's worth addressing there. So I guess what I'd like to do now is take a few minutes and maybe open it up for questions or discussion. I always learn a lot in this part of the talk. So if anyone has a question, I'd love to entertain it. Yeah. Schools, because I wondered if there was many people discussion to talk about same-sex schools as a real political advantage. And I was wondering why, when rich people who have the option, have long exercised the option to send their kids to single-gender schools. I don't know if it's not that. But when you look at the research, here's two single-gender schools seem to help. They seem to help poor African-American boys, and they seem to help girls. But when you look at the data, there's not much overall mandate for boys from single-gender schools. Now, a lot of public schools are starting to divide into single-gender academies, and I expect they'll be, and they've had mixed results from what I know just reading the newspaper, and I assume there'll be some broader data about that, but it's a little soon to those single-gender public academies really only done on pushing this switch in 2006. So it's a little early to really know what the data is going to look like there. Anyone else? Yeah. In the blue.
Who experienced the reading level of my boy being very high in the elementary and dropped down in middle school and struggling in high school. My question here is, besides moving and being like the teacher who are being mostly females, what other immediate recipe or solution can you offer a parent like me who is hounding my boy to read, but could not get any success.
I will speak to that, and one of the things I think you can do is broaden the amount of reading material you bring to him and what you think is appropriate. I'll tell you that graphic novels, sometimes what we call comic books, but a little more words, they sort of move from like very picture-oriented to more words than pictures, depending on the book. But they turn out to be a very good tool for a lot of children and a lot of boys between not reading and reading. So there's a lot of graphic novels that are very, very deep and very complicated and also very funny and violent and irreverent, and I think are very appealing to a lot of boys. I'll just tell you personally that my son started reading, and my husband and I are both writers, so it's a painful admission. They started reading Warhammer books they're like crappy serial novels based on those little figures that they fight and paint. It's like a Dungeons and Dragons thing. Listen, we're writers. It was kind of a horror to us because we were like, it's so crappy. But you know what? Reading is reading. And the more you read, the more you read. And you need to have children build up an endurance for reading. So anything you can get for him, any kind of reading material you can put in front of him is a good thing. There's a big debate about internet reading. We have the National Endowment of the Arts, and they're decrying the fact that young people don't read, and yet a lot of young people are reading on the internet. I think we read in a different way. I think we read, instead of text, we read in a more F-shaped way, like we go all the way across the page and then less so as we go down. So the reading style is different, but I think, to bring different kinds of books into your house is going to be a positive thing, especially graphic novels. And I wouldn't shy away from things that you might think would be a little too controversial for your family. Like, reading, it can be a subversive activity. It doesn't mean, I had to convince myself, it doesn't mean my kids are going to grow up to be obsessed with Dungeons and Dragons. They just wanted to read those kind of books for a while, and they passed through it.
Yeah. Do you see any impact on boys with the increasing numbers of single parents and predominantly female households?
That's a really good question. Okay, so the data on single parents is not encouraging. When you look at the data on single parents, first of all, we know that 33% of boys don't live with their biological fathers. And when you look at the data on single moms, the data is not good. They are more likely to struggle in school. They're more likely to be on ADHD medication, to have some interaction with the criminal justice system. But then, if you try and tease that out from the effects of poverty, there's no real good data that's separate about single moms and poverty. So it's not clear to me, when there's all this poo-pooing of single moms and how terrible it is, if we're really talking about poverty and not the effects of being a single parent or female-headed household. So to that extent, I don't really know. But I will tell you, and I don't write in my book about manliness and man stuff and the passage of manhood. Like, do you want to read that from me? No. Okay? I'm a woman. I don't know. That's beyond my area of expertise by far. But I will tell you, just thinking about that number, 33% of boys don't live with their biological fathers. So I read that number and I think, well, that makes sense to me. We know that there's a high rate of divorce, there's blended families, there's single parents. And we don't really talk about what that means for boys. But try and reverse it in your mind. Try and think like what it would be like in our culture if 33% of girls didn't live with their biological mothers. I mean, we have a section in Barnes & Noble for it, right? We have like a whole body of literature talking about what this means in the psychological development of girls not to live with their biological mothers. But for boys, we just don't really talk about it because we don't really want to know if it's bad for them or if they're suffering or if there's difficulty. We don't talk about it because we don't want to know. We have this idea in culture, I think it's sort of Victorian, that we can talk about the frailties of girls and their eating disorders and their stress and their depression, all very real, but I see that the media attention on those things and the way in which we engage in that discourse. But we don't really talk about boys. We want them to be stoic. We want them to be able to take it. Because that's what we want for them. That's kind of what we put on them as a community. So the answer is, I don't think there's really good, clean data. But the more I thought about it, the more I thought it must have an impact. I'm not sure it's measurable, but it must have an impact.
I think for sure it does. I think when you look at the problems that they said for African American boys, they're extraordinary, and they were very, very severe. And I think that when you look at poor Latino boys, there's other factors at work that are really beneath the radar to a lot of social scientists. I was just speaking to an interesting researcher from the University of Florida and Gainesville, and he's talking about the role of family for Latino boys and the fact that they are called upon in a way that a lot of second, third generation American boys aren't really called upon. Latino boys are called upon to be earners in their family in a way that we don't really appreciate in our school system a lot. But they have a pride in extended family and they pride in their role in it more than any problem, more than educational attainment. So in those ways, culture is enormous. Culture has enormous influence. So I think that's it, and I just, are you going to give some comments at the end? Okay, so let me just say that I want to thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it, and I will give them a shout out from my book.